Good evening and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. My name is Jeffrey Smith. I'm a Vice President of the Ford Hall Forum, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Tonight, Dr. Leonard Peikoff joins us for our final program of the fall season to discuss the fascinating topic of madness and modernism and whether or not our culture is insane. Over the past few weeks, the Forum offices have received many phone calls regarding Dr. Peikoff's lecture to you tonight, and I'm sure you're as excited as we are to hear him in person. Dr. Leonard Peikoff is recognized as the preeminent interpreter of Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy. He worked closely with Ayn Rand for 30 years and is designated as her legal and intellectual heir. He has taught philosophy at Hunter College, Long Island University, New York University, and has lectured on Rand's philosophy throughout the country. I am also pleased to be able to announce tonight that this spring Dr. Peikoff will join the faculty of a new institution, the Objectivist Graduate Center of the Ayn Rand Institute in Los Angeles, and he will teach history and philosophy. Dr. Peikoff is also the editor of numerous objectivist writings, including Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, the early Ayn Rand selections from her unpublished fiction, and The Voice of Reason, Essays in Objectivist Thought. His own writings include The Ominous Parallels and Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, which I'm also pleased to announce will be coming out as a quality paperback by New American Library next month. Now, it is my pleasure to present Dr. Leonard Peikoff.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have just returned from France, where I spent some weeks contemplating great art, medieval and early modern alike. The climax of my experience was at the Louvre, where I sat for 30 minutes at the foot of The Dying Slave by Michelangelo and felt pure reverence for genius and beauty. And I tell you that as the context, the perspective that I bring to our discussion this evening and to the topic of modern art. You will see where I am coming from when I talk about madness and modernism, if you appreciate what I take as art. And I want to start tonight with a paragraph on madness, specifically schizophrenia. Schizophrenia represents, in a sense, the nadir, the low point of the human mind. It is probably the worst of the psychoses, which often requires prolonged hospitalization and the services of a highly specialized subgroup of psychiatrists to try to cope with it. Schizophrenia, by the way, does not mean dual personality. Etymologically, it means split mind in a deeper sense. It means a single personality split between thought and reality, concepts and percepts and emotions. I'll explain as we proceed. The schizophrenic is not merely disturbed or dissociated. In the vernacular, he is crazy. Now, culture, the term, by contrast, seemingly represents the exact opposite. Culture signifies the height of human achievement, the sum of men's intellectual attainments, the full flowering of the mind in thought, literature, and art. Can there be a society in which these two manifestations, mental disease and high culture, are essentially the same thing? Can you imagine a civilization in which the influential humanities professors, the writers, the artists, are properly classified together with the sickest psychotics? My thesis this evening is taken from a recent book by Dr. Louis A. Sass, S-A-S-S, entitled Madness and Modernism. I'm using it as a podium right at the moment. brought out by Basic Books in 1992. Dr. Sass is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Rutgers. As a psychiatrist, he has treated many schizophrenics. As an educated man besides, he knows modern art, literature, and philosophy. His book discusses what he calls, quote, the eerie likeness, unquote, between schizophrenia and modern culture. Dr. Sass's book, in my judgment, is a mixture of fascinating suggestions and some incredible non sequiturs. So please be forewarned, my conclusions tonight are not all necessarily his and vice versa. Despite this fact, however, I have learned a lot from studying his book, and I will be quoting from it liberally. Schizophrenics, it's widely recognized, are as a rule the most abstract and the most philosophical of all psychotics. These patients are typically very interested in philosophy of a special kind, and their symptoms in one way or another are related to this interest. So let's begin with some metaphysics tonight. The kind of metaphysics, in other words, view of the universe, that characteristically intrigues and attracts schizophrenics. Schizophrenics are generally withdrawn and isolated types. They are withdrawn not only from other people and even from their own bodies, but also from the entire physical universe. The schizophrenic typically feels alone in the universe, as though the daily world, including the people around him, is somehow fleeting, a pretense, a flimsy stage setting, something fake, insignificant, alien, alienating. In short, reality to him, what we call reality, is not real. I quote one patient. Reality recedes from me. Everything I touch, everything I think, everyone I meet becomes unreal as soon as I approach. And here's from another. Why is it that while I see and hear and feel everything perfectly, it nevertheless does not seem real to me? And here's one more statement which hints at the kind of motive that often accompanies the schizophrenic's denial of reality. A young schizophrenic man writes that, quote, the importance of reality is merely a social sanction. Why should we be tied down? Note the words tied down. Why should we be tied down by the ideal of reality? Unquote. Schizophrenics continue to perceive physical objects, but these objects lose their solidity, what we can call their metaphysical stature. They lose their importance as entities to be focused on. They lose the urgency of being reality. What takes their place as the schizophrenic's primary object of focus? Well, some schizophrenics answer nothing. Nothing at all exists. Some talk about a supernatural or religious dimension. More often, however, they tell us not about a supernatural world, but about an inner world. Schizophrenics, the psychiatrists tell us, adopt an inner orientation. They are focused on, even obsessed with, the interior, the inward, the introspective. Reality to them is not the external world, but their own consciousness, their soul, their self, their mind, call it what you will. So this, in effect, is a form of solipsism, if you know that term. Solipsism holds that a given person's mind is the only true reality, and that everything else, including other people, are merely figments or products of his own mental processes. Quoting from one patient, there is no reality but only the spirit. For what is material reality no one knows, but what spirit is no one doubts who has experienced it. Unquote. Here is from Mary, another schizophrenic, quote. Get this because it's a very important quote. The least important thing in my life is its tangibleness. The only things that matter lastingly are the things that happen inside me. That's the schizophrenic credo. The adventures of my spirit are realer than the outer things that befall me. Unquote. And here is one final testament from a schizophrenic physicist. Quote, that is not a redundancy. There is no reason for believing in the existence of an unobservable, like an external world, and therefore my mind is my only reality. Now let us pause for a moment and see if we can discover any parallel so far between the schizophrenic outlook and that of modern culture. I have a long distance to reach down here for this. To begin with the obvious, what about modern art? How else would you define its essence except as a campaign or a war against physical objects? In other words, against the external world as such. In the past, painters, each from his own perspective, strove to capture physical entities on their canvases, and often to stylize and beautify them, whether in human portraits, action scenes, still lives, whatever. Modern art, however, defines itself as non-objective, non-representational. Objects as such are swept aside as crude, distracting, irrelevant to a deeper vision of life. In Dr. Sass's words, and he seems in a way to admire modern art if I can follow him, these painters, quote, rob the world of its substantiality or objectivity. They work to deny or overcome the obdurate independence of the world, unquote. Our modern cultural icons, as they regularly tell us, are alienated. That's been the recurrent term for many decades. They are alienated not primarily from Republicans or Americans or political institutions, but from something deeper, from physical reality itself. Do you remember the character in Sartre's famous novel who watched an innocent chestnut tree, saw its roots bulging with vitality, and felt the tidal emotion? Nausea. The sheer existence of the physical entity made him sick to his stomach. Here's a quote from Salvador Dali. My paranoid critical method, he's referring to his method of creating surrealist fantasies, continuing the quote, has a philosophic purpose: to contribute to the total discrediting of the world of reality. His goal, he says, is to ensure that, quote, the reality of the external world is put in the service of the reality of our mind, unquote. Now, sometimes, as in the case of Dali, the modern artist does not omit physical objects, but instead distorts them. For instance, by creating berserk juxtapositions of beautifully painted entities, such as Dali, or by painting entities as flat, attenuated, ugly, etc. The philosopher Ortega y Gasset gives an interesting explanation of the presence of such distorted objects in modern art. Quote, a minimal presence of naturalistic subject matter. This is from Ortega. A minimal presence of naturalistic subject matter serves the purpose of driving home a kind of victory over reality. It is a way of displaying the strangled victim, unquote. You see, if it's just smears, you don't know. But if you see remnants of something graspable, but it's butchered and smashed into hideousness, that's what he calls a way of displaying the strangled victim. What kind of thing then does matter to an art, and I might add to a literature and a philosophy which is unconcerned with external reality or even actively hostile to it? What matters, its practitioners regularly declare, is their own creative process. The process apart from reality. Or in other words, their own technique, apart from content, as an end in itself. Their own form or style. And this means what matters is the artist's inner intentions and subjective promptings. In other words, his own mental state or acts apart from representation of objects or from anything external. This is an art in which the essential orientation of the artist is interior, inward, introspective. This kind of artist is absorbed in and with consciousness. In an exclusive sense, he wants to be conscious of himself, his mental functioning, his feelings, and all of it apart from reality. To put it another way, what the modernist is trying to capture in his work is consciousness, usually his own, as against existence. And thus the novels which focus only on the inner life of the characters, their sensations, memories, word associations, etc., while brushing aside narrative, plot, and action as vulgar. Thus also the painters who tell us that they do not paint people or flowers. They paint their subconscious, or their psychological problems, or their dreams. Thus also the philosophers who play within a private domain of words and are busy analyzing these. In other words, figuring out the techniques of interrelating them, a task they pursue without reference to external reality, since these same philosophers regard reality as unknowable and words as a mere social convention. All of the above is the same rejection of the external and the objective, the same turning away from the physical world as the schizophrenics, along with the same substitute focus, the same new obsession, the preoccupation with the inward world, the spiritual, in quotes, the subjective. Now let us turn to another aspect of madness. There is a set of distinctive thinking disorders, common to schizophrenics and regularly listed in textbooks on the disease. Here in no special order are some samples, just enough to give you a sense of what we can call the cognitive or epistemological side of schizophrenia. Epistemologically, the key to schizophrenia is conceptual thought detached from reality. The schizophrenic thinks, but he does it as though in a private dimension, a world of floating ideas. He uses abstract concepts, as does any human being, but he does not use them primarily as a means to organize and understand concrete existential entities. His head, like Plato's universe, embraces two worlds: the world of ideas, which are pure, self-contained abstractions, and the world of concretes, of perceptual objects given by his senses. Because of this split, the schizophrenic, even when he tries it, typically cannot apply his abstract ideas properly to concretes. He does not know how to conceptualize concrete objects meaningfully, even when he focuses on them. Sass refers to this symptom as the, quote, the sheer peculiarity of the schizophrenic's generalizations and sortings, the use of principles that are highly personal, private, or bizarre, unquote. And he gives examples. For instance, a schizophrenic was asked what a fly and a tree have in common. He replied not that they are both living things, but that they both, quote, occupy space in our world. What is common to a table and a chair? The reply was not articles of furniture or anything so commonsensical, but rather that both table and chair are, quote, objects in the universe. Now, this kind of answer, which is typical, is sometimes referred to as a schizophrenic's pathological over-abstractness. It flows from his breach between concepts and percepts. Given this breach, he has no way to know when to invoke broad concepts and when to use narrower ones. Once reality, and therefore purpose and context, is dropped, there is no way for him to decide such questions. Excessively broad abstractions therefore take over. They help him to remain distant from concretes. In my recent book on objectivism, I mentioned a different kind of example of schizophrenic thought. Do you recall the patient I discussed who equated Jesus Christ, cigars, and sex? He put these three together under the same concept. He treated them in effect as interchangeable members of a single class, encirclist. You remember Jesus Christ he saw as encircled by a halo, cigars were encircled by a tax band, and in sex he saw the woman as being encircled by the man. So all these were instances of an encirclist, a thing being encircled by something. Now a normal person hearing about this man wants to cry out, but doesn't he see that Jesus' cigars and sex whatever their meaningless and circless resemblance, are essentially different. After all, one is a man, one is a manufactured product, and the third is a biological activity. The answer here is instructive. The schizophrenic loses the ability to think in terms of essentials. The schizophrenic loses the ability to think in terms of essentials. And essential is a factor which, in reality, has substantial effects or consequences. For example, the fact that a cigar contains tobacco is an essential. It is a feature that goes to the heart of what a cigar is because it involves a great many important consequences for the cigar. Without tobacco, what would be left of a cigar? Whereas being encircled by a tax band is an isolated feature, one which affects very little else and leads nowhere. To the schizophrenic, however, since concepts are detached from reality, they are detached from the laws of reality, i.e. from cause and effect also. The schizophrenic, accordingly, is a mental egalitarian. All aspects of things are equal to him. If an isolated aspect of something happens to strike him in relation to an isolated aspect of something else, for any reason at all, whether it is causally significant or not, that's good enough for him. Anything, in short, goes with anything, regardless of reality. He puts together arbitrarily whatever his mind feels like juxtaposing. As Silvano Arietti, a famous authority on schizophrenic thinking, phrases it, in this disease there is, quote, a loss of the will to organize acts or thoughts into a causal sequence, unquote. Now some other related symptoms. Concepts are symbolized by words. If concepts are floating, then one can expect words, at least some of the time, to turn into sounds without reference. This is the mechanism behind what are called neologisms, i.e. the uttering of pure gibberish, of noise posing as words, which is a common feature in schizophrenia. A variant of the same thing is words, actual words, strung together in defiance of any rules of grammar. Now, grammar is the science of how to combine words into sentences while adhering to reality. The schizophrenic, given his basic orientation, often prefers to combine words without reliance on any grammatical rules. And the result is called word salads. For example, lonely reach because we were into although our trenching. Then another symptom, glossomania. You heard of that one? In which the flow of speech is controlled by the sound patterns of the words. For example, when one patient was asked the color of a certain object, he replied, quote, looks like clay, sounds like gray, takes you on a roll in the hay, heyday, mayday, help. Now I'll pick up on the word help. The schizophrenic is helpless. He does not know how to use his mind. When somebody asks that he commit himself to some viewpoint on a question, any question, he typically refuses. Instead, in Sass's words, quote, he often shows endless hesitancy and striking inconsistency, unquote. Sass calls this symptom, it's a big mouthful, multi-perspectivism. I mean, a lot of perspectives. And defines it as the refusal to adopt one perspective, one single way of regarding a situation. Instead, the patient clings to contradictory perspectives at the same time. And Sass gives this example among many others. Quote, if asked to draw a picture of a human being, schizophrenics will often show the figure from external and internal standpoints at the same time, with both clothing and inner organs visible in an incongruous combination of perspectives, or from two different angles at once, unquote. Now, if you were asked to suggest to such a patient that he is being illogical, how do you think he might react? Here was one schizophrenic who was told that, quote, logic sounds clumsy to me. puritanical, unquote. Now, do you understand puritanical here? He means that logic is inhibiting. It inhibits his self-indulgence and forbids him his pleasures. And why does he need to use logic anyway? If his mind is reality and he wants a contradiction to exist, what is to stop him? I quote from Sass. None of the usual logical or realistic constraints need apply in a universe of pure idea. A man may die and yet be alive. Virginity may be lost and regained. A person may be in two places at once, frozen in the bathtub and yet still here, without any of these fantastical events occasioning shock or amazement, unquote. Now, given these kinds of symptoms, and I've just given you a taste, it is only to be expected that communication with schizophrenics is often impossible. Much of the time, even sympathetic psychiatrists find these patients inaccessible, hard to understand, devilishly obscure. Sass comments, quote, "It is difficult to say whether their obscurity is a simple byproduct of an introverted orientation, or whether obscurity has become a goal in itself, perhaps serving as a method of intimidation or of severing the social bond," unquote. Their legendary obscurity, Sass adds provocatively, often disappears abruptly when patients really want to make themselves understood, unquote. Now, back to modern culture for a bit. Are there any parallels between modernist thought and schizophrenic thinking? Well, schizophrenics, we said, detach abstractions from reality and engage in pathological over-abstraction. Do you want to find these symptoms in quantity outside of mental asylums? Visit any convention of the APA. That's the American Philosophical Association. The battle in philosophy departments today is between the linguistic types, who regard concepts as a verbal game detached from reality, and the metaphysical types, who claim to uphold reality, a reality which their books suggest cannot be captured by ordinary language, but only by a pathologically over-abstract jargon. For details, see the writings of Hegel, Heidegger, and a whole string of followers. If you want another kind of example here, observe that modern painters call their messy smears, or prissy dots, abstractions. One leading school imported from Germany rakes in a fortune under the banner abstract expressionism. Now, the term abstraction to these people obviously does not mean abstracting from concretes. In other words, focusing selectively on objects, identifying their common attributes while omitting their differences. To them, on the contrary, abstraction means taking off for points unknown and leaving the physical world behind. It means detaching oneself from concretes, and that is the schizophrenic's definition too. Does the schizophrenic, as we said, fail to grasp essences based on the causal sequences in reality? Well, there is no causality, modern philosophy has taught since Hume, and essences are merely arbitrary linguistic constructs. Well then, why bother thinking in terms of essentials, ask many of today's students. We don't, cry the modern literati. And here I quote Roland Barthes' well-known remark, well-known at least after I read this book, well-known to me, quote, "Thinking in essences is a disease," unquote. If so, it's one that he never has to worry about. Does the schizophrenic, freed from the tyranny of essences, concoct bizarre juxtapositions and anti-causal streams of data? Well, what about dadaism, surrealism, futurism, stream of consciousness literature, and the modern collages made of dirt and bus transfers? What is all this stuff other than the deliberate glorifying of the random, the purposeless, the arbitrary. In other words, of the anti-essential mentality. Does the schizophrenic succumb to neologisms and word salads? Read James Joyce. What about glossomania? Read Gertrude Stein or Lois Cook in The Fountainhead. Does the schizophrenic suffer from multi-perspectivism, the insistence on contradictory perspectives at the same time? What about, here I'm quoting Dr. Sass, the multi-perspectivism of analytic cubist painting in portraits by Picasso, as well as in poems like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, works in which, Sass goes on, a multiplicity of perspectives conveys the realization that reality includes our attempts to see it, unquote. Did you get that last one? Does the schizophrenic brush aside logic? What about modern philosophers who, like Adolf Hitler, teach multi-perspectivism in regard to logic itself? In other words, they teach the polylogist idea that there are many contradictory logics. What about all the modern artists in every field who regard logic and art as antonyms, art being above such a puritanical restriction as logic? Does the schizophrenic live contentedly with deliberate contradictions? What about the theater of the absurd? Are modernist writers, like schizophrenics, inaccessible, hard to understand, devilishly obscure? They are the first to boast about this fact, sneering at clarity, revering the ambiguous and the enigmatic, lighting up with joy when they see the bafflement in the eyes of their naive reader or spectator. To the modernist as to the schizophrenic, obscurity is an attention-getting and a distance-preserving device. For both groups, it is a badge of the elite, the proof that they belong to a special aristocracy above the common herd. Charles Baudelaire was shameless enough to confess this feeling openly near the very start of the modernist movement. There is, he said, and I'm quoting, there is a glory in not being understood. Now let's shuttle back to the asylum once more. Let's turn to the schizophrenic's equivalent of morality, i.e. his view of values. If there is no external world, then there can be no action in it. In other words, no pursuit of a goal, no value judgments. Values are based on and derived from facts. Once facts are relegated to the back burner, so are values. Schizophrenics accordingly suffer from what is technically called flat affect, which means a subdued or non-existent emotional life. Since he lacks strong and often any values, nothing seems to matter to this kind of patient. If you tell him that his wife was hit by a truck or that he has just inherited $1 million, he's likely simply to shrug indifferently. In the words of Emile Kraepelin, another famous authority, the patient lacks, quote, any strong feeling of the impressions of life, unquote. He strikes people as cold and unfeeling. I am dead, such patients may say. Or as one of them put it, quote, I am a sort of corpse with insomnia. Schizophrenics have few, if any, positive emotional responses to the world. They do, however, have some definite negative responses. And one typical response, are you ready for this, is laughter. Laughing, giggling, smirking, grinning. This sort of behavior is frequent among these psychotics and is often called the schizophrenic's irony or his ironic detachment. Sass refers to the schizophrenic's facetiousness and to his, quote, sardonic comments, often delivered in deadpan style, unquote. In other words, the patient not only withdraws from the world, but he likes to mock it at the same time. What does this symptom mean? Ayn Rand once described laughter to me in the sense of laughing at something as a metaphysical act, specifically as a denial of some entity's reality. Laughter, she said, amounts to the statement, oh no, this thing is preposterous, it's impossible, it can't be real. Schizophrenic laughter is the opposite of happiness. It is a form of subverting or cutting down other people, their values, reality itself. It's a form of anger, of lashing out at the alien external world. The emotional negativity of the schizophrenic comes out many other forms too, including these patients' well-known methodical contrariness. Quoting from Sass, he puts it very eloquently. He says, these patients generally take, quote, the path of most resistance. The path of most resistance, tending to transgress whatever customs and rules happen to be held most sacred in a given society. Unquote. And here's a statement from Eugene Bloiler, a pioneer in the field. These patients, he writes, quote, oppose everyone and everything and consequently become exceedingly difficult to handle. They may eat only secretly or at unusual times. They grumble about the food, but when asked what they would like to have, their only answer is something else, not what we have. To good day, they say goodbye. They do their work all wrong, sew buttons on the wrong side of their clothes. They eat their soup with a fork and the dessert with a soup spoon, etc. Now, this deliberate perversity may be part of the motive for the schizophrenic's misuse of language. His obscurity, to some extent, may well be deliberate, part of his breaking of all rules, in other words, an expression of his general metaphysical rage. Turning back now to our cultural leaders and their products. Do they suffer from flat affect or the absence of values? Well, one of the defining marks of the moderns is stressed ennui, boredom, metaphysical boredom, boredom with life and reality as such. There are no values being pursued in novels or plays which dispense with goal-directed characters. Novels and plays without heroes, story, or achievement. There are no values to be found in philosophers or poets who tell you that good and evil are arbitrary, that human purposes have no factual basis and no chance of success, that men are, you know the famous line, strangers and afraid in a world they never made. There is no concern with values in a Hollywood obsessed by chase scenes, special effects with or without dinosaurs as an end in itself, and blood-drenched horror spectacles. Do you see a love of values in Andy Warhol's Brillo pads? If that isn't flat affect, what is? As to the laughter syndrome, it is explicitly the modernists' cherished gimmick. What these people demand and project is not enjoyment or even a sense of humor, but specifically irony. In other words, the tongue-in-cheek snicker of the nihilist, not admiration of anything, but the scornful, hyperactive clowning of the dadaist, the surrealist, the absurdist, et al., as they whiz through their gleeful spree to smash the enemy, which is the bourgeoisie and any form of rationality. The whole thrust of the movement is not values, but a hatred of values. Not the depiction of a goddess, but the scrawling of graffiti on urinals. Not heroes, but anti-heroes. Not melody, but anti-tonality. Not any glorious new future, but the deliberate wiping out of any better 19th century past. Like the schizophrenic, and for the same reasons, the modernist also proudly travels the path of most resistance. He too is a rebel without a cause, i.e., without values. In its basic approach to values, as to concepts and to reality. Those three things, to values, to concepts, and to reality. Modern culture is in substance a twin of the schizophrenic pathology. Now let us integrate the symptoms we have been discussing. And let us start by asking, what is the philosophical essence of the schizophrenic mentality? And a quick review here as background. Philosophy reduces ultimately to two axioms: the world and the self, or the outer realm and the inner, or in objectivist terms, existence and consciousness. And you have only two alternatives in defining the relationship between these axioms. One, you can place existence first and construe consciousness as a derivative. Ayn Rand calls this approach, which objectivism upholds, the primacy of existence. Its thesis is, the world is real, existence exists, it is the irreducible primary, and consciousness is the faculty of perceiving it. Two, the alternative is to place consciousness first and construe existence as a derivative. This is what Ayn Rand calls the primacy of consciousness. In technical philosophy, it's called idealism. In this view, consciousness, or mind, or self, is the fundamental reality, and existence is a product of it. So that consciousness is not the perceiver of reality, but its creator. Now, which of these two orientations is represented by schizophrenia? Which? Obviously, the primacy of consciousness. The essence of schizophrenia is the feeling that the external world is unreal and unimportant. Concepts are not to be connected to the world. Values are not to be pursued in it. What's really real is, quote, my mind. His own mind, the patient feels, is the primary on which the external world depends. Now you may ask, does the schizophrenic really believe this idea? Well, according to Dr. Sass, schizophrenics share many kinds of delusions and hallucinations with other psychotics. But some of their most characteristic delusions are distinct. They're cosmic in scope, and their content is a delusion of power, of metaphysical power. These patients often feel that they have the power to create or mold reality itself. Here are some examples. Quote, one patient experienced physical objects and human beings as somehow emanating from her own eyes. And then there's a quote from this patient. Many things come out of my lovely blue eyes. For example, bed sheets, smoothly ironed pillows, commodes, stockings of all colors. I have to skip because I haven't time. And finally, people fly out, fortunately not naked, but completely dressed, unquote. Here's another patient. The whole, quote, the whole world, sometimes the whole universe, is in a sense a part of me. Another signed himself the beginning and end of the world. Another refused to swallow, quote, because each time she did, she swallowed the entire world. Another believed, quote, that his gaze was a kind of radar beam that moved people about, unquote. Another thought, quote, that he could control the weather by shifts in his inner mood. Now, what is the common denominator of these delusions? These mentally ill people, at least part of the time, take the primacy of consciousness, of their own consciousness, literally. They regard the external world as their mere product or plaything. And their attitude to concepts and to values follows as a corollary. Such, in my judgment, and as far as I can follow him in Sass's too, is the real philosophic essence of the schizophrenic mentality. Now let me remind you that the schizophrenic sense of power is a delusion of grandiosity. And interestingly, much of the time the patient themselves know it. Very often, far from feeling a sense of cosmic power, they feel the opposite. They complain poignantly of feeling helpless, vulnerable, terrified. They say that they face imminent annihilation or looming nothingness. They say that they feel overwhelmed by anxiety, numbness, pain. Their anxieties are certainly understandable. If a man breaks with reality for whatever reason, innocent or otherwise, he thereby loses any power he would have to understand and deal with it. The end result can only be a sense of helplessness, terror, and doom. Now back to the classroom and the gallery. Do modern professors and artists accept and project the primacy of consciousness? Is that notion also their essence and root conviction? For a moment, I'm going to surprise you, because in a sense my answer is no. Leaving aside the schizophrenics among them, and there's quite a surprising number, but leaving them aside, the modernist does not believe that bed sheets emanate from his eyes, or that his mood determines the weather. In some terms, the modernist, like all non-psychotics, distinguishes between existence, which is independent of him, and his mind, whose task, he knows, is to perceive, not to create reality. Insofar as he is sane, the modernist has to recognize the primacy of existence, because only that recognition keeps anybody sane. But now look at the other side of the modernist picture. The modernist, let us say, is sane, but he is sane in spite of himself, in spite of his professed philosophy and art. I say this because the essence of modernism as a cultural orientation is pure primacy of consciousness. The primacy of consciousness is not only the explicit lesson modern philosophers teach their classes. It is the very universe which modern writers and artists recreate in their works. And let us be clear on this point. Normal men, including normal non-modern artists, may be said to desire power in a sense. They want the power to understand reality and thereby to achieve their values in the world through appropriate rational action. But modern artworks reflect their creators' desire for an utterly different kind of, quote, power. These men want the power to control reality itself. What else is the meaning of an artwork that flouts all sense, reduces physical objects to chaos, embraces at the same time deliberately contradictory perspectives, and gloats over the corpse of reality? All of it simultaneously broadcasts and tries to actualize a single principle: the metaphysical power of whim, the power of the whim worshipper to create or destroy any reality he wishes, any time he feels like it. What the modern artist recreates and publishes between covers, or hangs in a frame for us to fawn over, is the very same universe that the schizophrenic takes seriously, at least seriously enough to get put into a hospital for. Now, the modernist has his own version of a split mind. There is his daily, prosaic, primacy of existence routine, and there is his cherished philosophy and art at war with it. Somehow, and don't ask me how, these people switch the one orientation off, or part off, and the other on, or part on, as the spirit moves them. So there is some difference in the way these two groups, modernists and schizophrenics, hold their basic premise. There is some difference in the intensity or consistency of their primacy of consciousness. But the difference is not absolute, and to be honest, it is not very clear to me. Part of the reason for my unclarity is that the schizophrenic also switches premises. Some of the time, he too knows somehow that the primacy of consciousness is wrong. In a sense, he knows it even as he announces it, which is one explanation of the fact that he rarely tries to act on his metaphysical delusions. Whereas delusions characteristic of other psychotics, they do try to act on. The other part of the reason for my unclarity here is that the modern artist is not a mere poseur or hypocrite, preaching one philosophy while living by another. On the contrary, in some sense, and here I'm leaving aside the many out charlatans among them, but in some sense, the modernists are sincere. Much of the time they really believe in and live by the primacy of consciousness. Both their works and their moans convince me that they do hate reality. They do desperately desire to transcend and defeat it, and they do suffer the unavoidable affective result of this attitude. Like the schizophrenic, and for the same basic reason, the modernist feels one essential emotion, which he tells us insistently in his novels, his paintings, and his cocktail parties. He feels terror, the fear of nothingness, the imminence of the apocalypse. For further details, read Schopenhauer, or Kierkegaard, or Kafka. And then try to figure out who is more miserable, the gibbering psychotic or the modern intellectual. The title of Dr. Sass's book, I've given you just a hint, is Justified. There is an eerie likeness between madness and modernism. Schizophrenia, in his words, is, quote, a simulacrum of the modern world in the most private recesses of the soul, unquote. Now let us turn to etiology. Why? What root cause is at work here, turning Western culture into a specific form of madness? Well, since we are dealing with the primacy of consciousness, in other words, with an issue of fundamental philosophic orientation, we must seek the root cause in the field of philosophy. Which philosopher? I'll give you a hint. Which German philosopher 200 years ago put an end to the rule of the primacy of existence in the West and established in its place a 2-century-long rule of the primacy of consciousness? By now, everyone here must know the answer, because I have denounced this man for this exact reason in many speeches from this very forum. I am happy to say that at last Ayn Rand and I are not alone on this point. Although Dr. Sass's estimate of him differs from mine, Dr. Sass names the same man I do as the root cause of modern developments. We both name Immanuel Kant, the thinker who convinced the West that reality is unknowable and all we can know is a phenomenal world which we create by our own subjective mental structures. Kant is widely acknowledged to be the father of all subsequent philosophy, from Fichte, Hegel, and Marx on down to today's shambles. Kant is also the source of the West's distinctively modernist culture, from literature and art to education and manners. And for details, I refer you to my book, The Ominous Parallels, which works out that thesis at length. But what is most surprising to me in this context is that Kant, it seems, also has a connection to the very disease of schizophrenia itself. Now, this last point is controversial. It is at best a likely hypothesis, but I can't resist mentioning it in passing. Now get this one, according to Dr. Sass, there is very little evidence of schizophrenia having occurred in the ancient or medieval periods, or in primitive or non-Western areas of the globe to this day, although there is evidence of other psychoses in all these times and places. Schizophrenia, he thinks, appears primarily in the developed West, and not until, and now I'm going to quote from him, it appears not until, quote, the end of the 18th century or the beginning of the 19th. I'm quoting, schizophrenia's emergence coincided with the birth of the modern epistemology identified with the Kantian revolution at the turn of the 19th century, unquote. Now, in other words, he's saying schizophrenia requires a Kantian culture in which to flourish. It requires a society in which the primacy of consciousness is like an axiom, taken for granted everywhere. And at one point, Sass goes so far as to write, quote, "It is in fact almost as if schizophrenics were living out some form of transcendental idealism," unquote. That's a technical term for Kant's philosophy. And indeed, Sass even mentions one of his patients, Martin. This blew me away. Martin stated that, quote, "Reading Kant was a very calming experience for me." Continue from Martin. "Kant has been where I am going. And this provided me with security, the feeling that it was okay to feel what I was feeling." Unquote. I mean, you can't say anything after that. Now, I am not a psychiatrist. I obviously can't discuss this theory of schizophrenia any further. If it's true, it's merely one more proof of the title that one contemporary of Kant's, the philosopher Jacobi, bestowed on him. He called Kant the all-destroyer. Now remember that Kant's power to destroy flowed from a single point, which Kant placed at the heart of our society: his all-out attack on reason, his claim that reason is impotent to know reality. Given this fact, what do you think would be the most mistaken claim an interpreter at this point could make? I doubt that you have the imagination to guess it. I didn't. So I will merely inform you here of Dr. Sass's interpretation of the phenomena he so eloquently describes in his book. The deepest common denominator between schizophrenia and modern culture, he says, the basic error they both commit is they seek too much self-awareness, too much consciousness, too much reason. The two groups, he writes, quote, "may be actually products of a kind of hyper-rationality, forms of irrationality generated by rationality itself," unquote. Schizophrenia and modern culture, he suggests at one point, illustrate for us, quote, "the dangers in the enshrining of reason," unquote. I have neither the time nor the stomach to discuss this aberration of Dr. Sass, which is as outlandish as any schizophrenic symptom in his book. The explanation, of course, is that Sass, too, is a Kantian. I will simply tell you the difference between Dr. Sass and me on the present topic. He concludes from the parallels he presents that schizophrenics should be more highly respected, that they are more rational than we think. I conclude the opposite. Not that schizophrenics are better than we know, but that 20th century writers and artists are much, much worse. Not that schizophrenics are too enamored of reason, but that modern culture, judged by the DSM-3R, in other words, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition revised. In other words, modern culture judged by official technical definition is pure insanity. A rhetorical question. How long do you think an industrial civilization can survive this kind of cultural pandemic? It's rhetorical because the answer is self-evident. What is the solution? We need to define and spread the answer to Kant. The answer involves an entire philosophy, but it starts with a single principle. What is that starting point? Let me quote some brief fragments here from a recovered schizophrenic writing about her emergence from madness. Quote, "Instead of infinite space, unreal, where everything was cut off, I saw reality, marvelous reality for the first time. The people whom I encountered were no longer phantoms, gesticulating without meaning. They were men and women with their own individual characteristics. It was the same with things. They were useful things, having sense, capable of giving pleasure. Here was an automobile to take me places, cushions I could rest on. With the astonishment that one views a miracle, I devoured with my eyes everything that happened. This is it, I kept repeating, and I was actually saying, this is it, reality, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the basic answer to schizophrenia, to modern culture, and to Immanuel Kant. This is it, reality. Now you know why Ayn Rand began objectivism with the principle that existence exists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peikoff, for sharing your views with us tonight. Now, as you know, this is the time we give members of the audience an opportunity to present questions to you, to elaborate on your views. Since the program is being taped for cablecast, I would appreciate it if anybody who has a question would come to either one of the two microphones in the front of the two aisles, and I will call upon you. So if anyone has a question, we'd be pleased to have Dr. Peikoff respond. Yes, sir.
Dr. Peikoff, what in your view are some of the greatest, or your personal favorite works of art in history?
Well, that's a pretty easy question considering what you could have asked. Do I have to repeat that question?
No.
Some of the greatest favorites of mine in art history takes in a tremendous territory. In literature, my favorites are the Romantics, the 19th century Romantics, Hugo, Dostoevsky. I love as playwrights, Rostand. Any playwrights that present man as a being of stature, confronting a world with he has a purpose, a goal, he fights against obstacles, against conflicts, and either wins or loses, but it's an ennobling experience to watch him, follow him. I gave a course of what I consider the greatest plays in history, and they all had that common denominator, whether it was Montaigne or Sophocles, even Shakespeare in many cases. Now, jumping from that, I like a great deal of romantic music, some of the Baroque music. My favorite of all arts, believe it or not, is sculpture. And my favorite, it should be obvious from my writings and speeches in that field, is Michelangelo. If I had nothing else to do, I would just shuttle between Paris and Florence and just sit at the feet of those statues perennially. I don't know how else even to begin answering. That's a start.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Peikoff, where does one draw the line with modern art or modern philosophy, such as like M.C. Escher with his art? It was realistic, but yet at the same time modern. Where can you draw the line?
Well, when do I call something modern?
Yeah.
Well, partly it's the time frame in which it exists, and partly it's the attributes of the thing, to what extent it coheres with the rest of the works that belong in that period. It's not exclusively a time thing, because you could do a completely representational work today, and that would not make it modernistic. Take Impressionism as an example. Impressionism leads toward modern art, but in itself it is still entirely representational. There's a blurring of the edges that you can see is a line moving from what the earlier approach was till you get to complete non-representational works. I don't think you can place an exact line. As my definition in terms of painting is, as long as it is discernible objects as man perceives them. The crucial thing is it has to be in accordance with man's means of perception. But if you have, for instance, wristwatches melting, and floating through empty space in defiance of gravity, etc., to say nothing of just dots and smears, that becomes modernistic at that point.
Dr. Peikoff, it has been described that there is a split in our country, a split between the intellectuals and, let's say, the average person, that most people don't believe this garbage. Does that split still exist in our society? You described in your book, The Ominous Parallels, how it did not exist in Germany. Does it still exist today? To what extent is it closing?
Well, the split that you refer to certainly exists, but in this particular issue, in regard to modern art, is much, much broader than simply the United States. There is no people in any country of the entire world that buys modern art or modern culture. Not any. This is entirely an intellectual phenomenon put over by intellectuals with no popular appeal. The only way that they're able to survive at all financially is through government handouts and subsidies, which is why they're so keen on government money. And also by the fact that, if you'll notice, they continuously combine modernist stuff with traditional stuff. So you'll go to a ballet, for instance, and part of it will be classical ballet, and the other part of it will be their smearing their bodies and rolling over upside down, and the things that they do, which they call modernist dance. When they only put on that kind of spectacle, just as if they only put on the modern Screechings or John Cage, etc., they get no audience. They simply can't survive. And that is not only in the United States. No people anywhere buy this phenomenon. It's entirely sustained by an intellectual elite and government money. It would be impossible in a free society, and it's impossible ever to have a public for that kind of work. So the split that I was talking about definitely exists on a much broader scale on this issue.
Dr. Peikoff, I was wondering, with regards to your reference about car chases in movies, I'm speaking about car chases in movies being the predominant theme.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to one movie that I think won't have any car chases, and I was wondering if you had any information about the production of the movie Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, let me just clarify. I will get to the issue of Atlas Shrugged, but I didn't mean to suggest by that any time one character chases another, that is anti-value. That's obviously not the case. If there were something important at stake, and the person chasing the other was a hero or a villain, and there was some goal to be achieved, and the purpose of the chase was the result, then of course a chase could be exciting. I was talking about chases where they're concerned only with the technical direction of all the wild special effects and the frenzy, etc. And they couldn't care less who is chasing who or why they're doing any chasing or what's going to be the result of the chase. There's no story. There's just somebody had the idea, let's go on for 20 minutes now with a bizarre chase with Stallone flying through space for whatever he's after this time. Now, as far as the Atlas Shrugged movie, it's at the stage now where a company has been formed, and they are trying to raise independent financing. A director and a producer have been picked, and the question is whether they're going to be able to raise the financing to do it or not. And it's impossible for me to predict at this time whether they're going to succeed or not. They're making manful and valiant attempts, and they're having some success. It's just too early to say. If they can raise the money, then I have the belief and the hope that they'll be able to produce a worthwhile movie of Atlas Shrugged. And that's a big statement to make in today's world.
Dr. Peikoff, my question is similar to that. What do you know about the remake of The Fountainhead?
The only thing I know about the remake of The Fountainhead, the only thing I know is that I have no rights over it. I don't control the property. When Miss Rand signed the movie rights, she was not yet in a position of fame where she could demand control over remakes. And consequently, she signed it away as a necessity of having the original movie made. And that was subsequently bought up by another company, and another company, I think, ended up being owned by Ted Turner, who has now, who has sold the rights, the option to somebody else, whom I don't know. That's not exactly accurate. I had lunch with him, but I don't know him, and I have no input into the process, so I know nothing about that. Thank you. And don't blame me for it when it comes out.
Dr. Peikoff, I have a more general question. What, in your opinion, is the role and value of cooperation in society, and what are, in your opinion, are the conditions for its success?
Well, that's certainly a big switch from the topic that we were doing. In a general way, cooperation, if you mean the relationship between two or more people, when they pursue a goal together by separating aspects of the task, or by one doing one thing and one doing another, cooperation is absolutely essential to human survival, except on a desert island. There's no question of cooperation. Nature doesn't cooperate with you, and animals don't. And there it's just a matter of you take what you can, and if you can't get it, you die. But in a human society, people can achieve feats by joint action that would be impossible to any man by himself. So certainly, I want to correct any implication, if there was one, that you're asking me that question because I'm an individualist, and an individualist is somebody who opposes cooperation. It's not true at all. But what makes you an individualist also answers the second part of your question, which is, under what conditions is cooperation valuable? When it is voluntary, when it is non-coerced, when there is no initiation of force, when two people mutually agree, each one, that he wishes to achieve a certain end and he's prepared to do so-and-so in exchange for the other person doing so-and-so. In other words, when you have a free society, when does cooperation, harmful if you call it cooperation, mutual working together, when it's under a whip, under a gun, or the way it's, the modern form of that right now is under a government. Then you don't have cooperation anymore, you have extirpation of the mind. You have then masters and slaves, and you see that happening all over the world today. Now, I certainly don't want to change from art to medicine, but for instance, what President Clinton is suggesting in regard to medicine is the utter perversion of the proper cooperation, because his idea is to ensure to everyone in the country, to guarantee to everyone in the country medical care. How can you guarantee as a right medical care without at the same time owning the providers of the medical care? If they are free agents, you cannot guarantee their services to somebody else. It's physically, logically impossible. So inherent in guaranteeing medical care is taking over the body and, more important, the minds of the providers of that care, whether it's the pharmacists, the surgeons, the internists, whatever. And what does that practically consist of? It consists of massive details of bureaucratic statement of how they can and can't perform their function, what they must and mustn't do, what expenditures are and aren't permitted, what kind of procedures will and will not be allowed. It means basically the government taking over the mind of the doctors. I'm giving you this as propaganda, but just as an example. You cannot have productive medicine under those circumstances. You cannot have doctors who are going to be anything better than postmen, because you're having exactly the same conditions. And the result is going to be a disaster and a perfect example of the destruction of cooperation. It'll be joint effort, but it'll be joint effort of enslaved minds, and the result is going to be catastrophe. I just put that across the board. You'll see why I think that if you want cooperation, it can only be done under an individualist, free, capitalist society.
Dr. Peikoff, do you believe that the issue of primacy of consciousness in a person exists on the belief in primacy of consciousness exists on a continuum, and that schizophrenia would be the extreme, that in a given man it can be mixed. You could have certain issues or certain premises about which you believe that wishing makes it so, but that overall you're not that kind of person.
I believe there is a continuum, but I also believe that that is a question that is not known. Because the complicated thing to me is that what I tried to indicate in the talk is that there is a sense in which nobody really believes it. I alluded to this in the talk. For instance, if you take a typical non-schizophrenic psychotic, like a manic depressive, and he will have the delusion, let us say, that he is going to become world famous. And his delusions would be a result of a sense of grandiosity. But then it will lead him to take a certain kind of action. He will, start buying up properties right and left in order, and he'll spend all of his money, or he'll start litigating frantically, suing everyone if he thinks they're trying to persecute him, etc. There'll be a correlation between his delusion and his action. So you can say, in some sense, even though this man is crazy, he believes his delusion, and you can see it in his action. But the interesting thing about the schizophrenics, this lady, for instance, who believed that people emanate from her eyes and so on, they say these things. Now, they are not lying. They're not just putting on an act. But they don't believe it in the way that the manic depressive, for instance, believes his delusions. If you said to this lady, well, fine, since bed sheets are coming out of your eyes, you can sleep on the floor tonight, and just emanate out the bedding that you need, she would just throw up her arms and say, that's ridiculous. The floor is hard. There's no attempt to turn those delusions into actual practice. You see what I mean? They will say to you, for instance, the world is full of poison. And at the same time, they say, pass the coffee. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a sense, therefore, in which the schizophrenics themselves, who are the extreme of the primacy of consciousness, don't believe it. And yet there's another sense in which they do believe it, because there's a reason that they're, in the condition that they're in. In the same way, there's a sense in which everybody that can cross the street believes in the primacy of existence. And on the other hand, there's a sense in which virtually nobody does, because in one form or another, you could take the most decent person and you will find, because of the cultural training and because of the centuries of Kant, some form of superstition or the belief in astrology or in some form of mysticism or some idea that if I wish it or if we all wish it, it's going to happen. So there's what psychologists have to do is map out in what way you can hold some beliefs inconsistently and yet with terrifying consequences. And you can do that in many different forms. That is a field that I'm almost thankful I'm not in. This was my one-time excursion into the field of psychiatry, and it was only this book, the only way I got to this topic, as I read the review in the New York Times, and I thought, what an idea! A psychiatrist, thinks that madness and modernism are the same. I'll have to read the book. And then I got hooked on it that way. But I am no authority on this field, and therefore I hesitate to say it's literally a continuum, because metaphysics is not the kind of thing that can be like, metaphysics is more like pregnancy. You have it or you don't. It doesn't it come in degrees. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's a very complicated question to try to figure out how people combine opposite metaphysics. And that's why I said in the talk that I was unclear where you draw the line between these types of people, and I still am. So I don't even want to go so far as to say it's a continuum. It's a field to be explored.
I had a question to begin with, and then some remarks later, raise some comments. Which I have a feeling that you're throwing too many things into one basket in order to substantiate the thesis. I wouldn't be very eloquent because I'm a technician in my application and mathematician by education, so I don't know enough perhaps. But you seem to have thrown into this basket of schizophrenia-oriented any kind of idealism. And just as a mathematician, we work in the realm of the mind, even when I try to solve an engineering problem. And therefore, I've learned that this is somewhat crazy-oriented.
Somewhat what?
Crazy or schizophrenically oriented. A mathematician work
Can I just
divorced completely. Before, let me finish.
Allow Dr. Peikoff to respond.
Okay.
I think I get the drift of your question, and if I do, you're misinterpreting something I said. Any form of thought takes place in the mind. Any form of creativity, imagination, all reasoning. I mean, I'm not denying the existence of the mind. The question is, what is the relation between the mind and reality when it's functioning?
The structures of mathematics are usually completely divorced from reality.
Well, so that we have a...
That's my vocation.
Let me say, if that is your view, you are placing yourself by your definition in the field of schizophrenia. But I do not regard mathematics that way.
Well, you
I
don't
am an
practice it.
Aristotelian, excuse me, I get to answer the questions here, you just get to ask them. I regard mathematics as being a factual science like physics, biology, astronomy, or any other. I do not regard it as a Platonic dimension in which you play with ideas that are divorced from reality. I do not believe any mathematical concept, principle, branch, or field is divorced from reality. And therefore, I entirely reject the idea that there is such a thing as an entire subject in which you're just in another dimension and somehow you can apply it to this world and achieve practical results. I flatly reject that on philosophic grounds. So our difference rests in our view of what is mathematics. But I can only say to you that I do not equate the use of the mind with schizophrenia. I equate the use of the mind while detaching yourself from reality. And then as far as that is concerned, if the shoe fits, wear it.
Thank you. Next question, please.
There are many other philosophies, non-Western philosophies, which actually hold primacy of consciousness and other irrational principles at its base. What is it about Kant's philosophy and Western culture that made schizophrenia so prevalent here?
Well, that is a very good question, because I think most religions, in many ways, preach the primacy of consciousness. And I wondered in reading this book why the primacy of consciousness, as widespread as it is, did not have greater effects of the kind you're suggesting. I don't entirely know. I think it's something to do with the conjunction of Kant on a previously very sane, pro-this world society. See, what I think the rest of the world basically has done is make a split, insofar as they're civilized at all, is make a split between their philosophy and the way they actually live. Philosophy is a ritual that they don't make any attempt to translate into their daily actual practice. Insofar as they do, they just atrophy completely. But what happened in the West is you took a society that was as close as possible to functioning on a rational basis. This is since the breakup of the medieval period, when the ancient ideas were reintroduced. You took a society that took philosophy more seriously in that sense than it had ever been taken, in that people were actually trying to live by and advance by the ideas they preached. And in the middle of that, you threw the most heinous version of mysticism and the rejection of the mind. And you created thereby an incredible split that has no precedent in any other form of society that I know of. It's that conjunction, I think, that makes, instead of us being like a hobbled society, the way the typical Oriental or non-Western or pre-rational civilization was, you took and turned it into a monster. You turned it into something that was able to function, had the means and the technology and the capacity to live by highly sophisticated abstract formulations, and then you threw the exact opposite of the truth into that mechanism. And the result was to make not just a split society, but a thoroughly diseased one that's eating itself up. That's the closest I can get, but I think it's an excellent question, and I wish I knew more Oriental history and philosophy. Let me just say that it is my intention to study the field of history, not because of this reason, but more broadly, and maybe at some point I'll give you a more
studying actually Chinese history, so maybe we can talk about it sometime.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think that's a good question.
Dr. Peikoff, I realize that you're not a psychologist, so I'll try and I'll try and ask this in a general way. Well, actually, just for your personal view, what do you think the glorification of madness in our society has upon social interaction and the cultural environment in terms of people being able to look at each other with respect, and in terms of being able to feel they can trust other people, without really knowing them, like the man on the street type situation? Do you think it has a profound effect upon the
absolutely.
cultural atmosphere?
I think that what you call a glorification of madness, and that's a good phrase, what that has, even people who don't share it or who scoff at it, the average man in the street who thinks it's all awful, still holds it in some kind of respect on the grounds that he doesn't know, but all the authorities say this is art. They all say this is great. They all put this in museums and they teach it to the kids in school and so on. So most people, and including the best, the most decent people, have a tremendous self-doubt implanted in themselves by this kind of phenomenon. If I'm answering your question, when they see this type of thing, they think, what is the matter with me if I don't understand it? What is the matter with them if they like it? It puts a tremendous, the best way I can answer your question maybe is like this. 10 centuries from now, when they look back at our era, and they see what we took as sculpture and as painting and as music, and they see these ineffable shapes and screeches, there's going to be entire classes on what made this possible in the 20th century. It's going to be looked at exactly like you would hear about some medieval sect, that would wait for the priest to start flagellating them, and they would run through the prescribed motions, ripping their hairs out, etc. And you think, it's really bizarre. You need a whole course to try to figure out how it could ever have happened. Now, at the time that it happened, they just took it as, this is the way things are. And the same thing is true of our society. We have reached, and I think that's why we are on the verge of total destruction. But just to come back to your question at the very end, I think there's a tremendous sense of distrust that everybody has of everybody as a result of the ideas and the art that are permeating the world today. There used to be, and this has been written many times, not just by objectivists, a great sense of goodwill of man toward man prior to the outbreak of World War I. And it has often been written that to those born after World War I will never know what feeling of goodwill individuals had to others who were simply strangers. The sense that we all have in common an intelligible, rational world. We can all, live together, work together, and everything is, they took progress as an axiom. Things are getting better and better in every way. They thought that was self-evident. World War I ended that. But not just on the political level. It ended it on all levels. And that was the time when this whole modern culture took over, and with it, the whole modern totalitarianism, communism, fascism, and now we're at the point where it's all expiring, and nobody believes in anything anymore. Communism has collapsed. Even modern art can't shock anybody. There's nothing left to shock anybody anymore. And you're at the burnt out embers where everybody feels despair, futility, and what is left. And art has art is supposed to be the inspiration of man, showing him the way, this is the objectivist view, to the ideal. And instead it's become one of the engines of alienating everyone from everyone else, engineering self-doubt, and pushing the whole world to the total disaster, which is the end of the world. And on that upbeat, I'll conclude.
Excuse me. Two very brief questions, please.
Dr. Peikoff, I enjoyed your lecture. A but my question is also unrelated. I was here in 1992, early in 1992 when you spoke, and recommended that the members of the audience vote for President Clinton, or then candidate Clinton. Given the given reason, what you stated at the time was an imperative for change, which
That wasn't my reason.
well, you said that Bush must be out of office.
Yeah, that changed. I was for one change.
So I was hoping that you could articulate.
Do I regret my recommendation? No, I do not.
I was hoping that you could articulate the objectivist principle which would morally justify a vote for a perpetrator of force.
Well, any vote for any modern candidate is a vote for a perpetrator of force. The last person you could have voted for without that problem is maybe Thomas Jefferson. Now, wait a minute. So the question becomes, to what extent in a given context are you preserving freedom or threatening it? That's how you have to judge. Every candidate is going to be for coercion 1,000 times over. But you have to judge within that context. Sometimes, and this is certainly true, you should just boycott all candidates. But sometimes there are cases where, although both of them are disgusting, there's a strategic reason for getting rid of one of them and letting the other disgusting one take its place. And I definitely believe that, and I think last election was that. And I just to finish, because I don't want to go into politics for the rest of the night, I don't believe that if Bush had been elected, things would be any different. We had a spectacle of Republicans actually serving as an opposition for about 33 seconds, which they never would have done under Bush. So whatever tax increase he would have had would have sailed through. At least Clinton's was, to some extent emasculated. Whatever socialized medicine Clinton is going to get through, Bush would have got through 3 years later. But it would have all come through. Only the worst part of it would be that Republican wing would be entrenched forever. At least that wing has been slapped down. The country does not like the Democrats, and I said when I recommended Clinton that he would not be popular, and that he would not be able to get away with major murders, only minor ones. And I think that remains true.
It sounds pragmatic, not objective.
No, it's not pragmatic in the sense of unprincipled, because the principle has to be self-preservation. If you have a choice of someone who's going to shoot you now and someone is going to shoot you in 10 years and you have no other choice, but you have 9 more years to save your life, it is not pragmatism, it is self-preservation to try to buy 9 more years.
Dr. Peikoff, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Peikoff.